Imagine, if you will, the ultimate historical contradiction.
Right.
On one hand, you have this brilliantly intelligent, deeply devout ruler,
Yeah.
a man who composed complex Orthodox liturgical hymns, expanded a relatively small medieval state into a massive global empire, and, built some of the most iconic, breathtaking architecture in human history.
It's quite the resume.
It is. But on the exact same hand, you have a man who drowned thousands of his own subjects in freezing rivers.
Right.
A man who created a sadistic secret police force to terrorize his own country, and in a fit of just blinding animal rage, murdered his own beloved son and heir.
It is a staggering, almost unbelievable paradox to wrap your head around.
Totally.
And yet it is the defining legacy of Ivan IV, a ruler universally known to history as, well, Ivan the Terrible.
Right, so today's deep dive is a biographical journey into the life of the very first Tsar of Russia. Using a stack of historical sources, biographies, and research, we are going to untangle the myth from the man. We're exploring how a deeply traumatized orphan boy constructed the absolute foundations of the modern Russian state.
And yet ultimately plunged his entire realm into terror.
Exactly, into terror, economic ruin, and this dark era known as the Time of Troubles. But before we get into the blood, the betrayal, and the empire building, we have to unpack that famous nickname.
Oh, absolutely.
Because right off the bat, Ivan the Terrible feels a little bit like a cartoon villain moniker.
It definitely paints a specific picture, but that's actually a trick of translation.
Really?
Yeah, the Russian word used in historical epithet is Grozny. Now, when you and I use the word terrible in modern English, we usually mean something is like defective, low quality, or overtly evil.
Right, like a terrible movie.
Exactly. But Grozny doesn't mean that at all. It leans much more toward the older, archaic English definition. It means formidable, terrifying, or awe-inspiring.
Okay, so less like a terrible movie and more like a terrible thunderstorm.
Precisely. In fact, a 19th century dictionary defined Grozny, specifically when applied to czars, as courageous, magnificent, magisterial, and keeping enemies in fear, but people in obedience.
Wow, that is a very different vibe.
It is. And what really adds nuance here is that historian Edward Keenan points out how Ivan's reputation in popular culture as this purely sadistic, quote-unquote, Oriental despot was actually fueled heavily by Western travel literature.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was in many ways early anti-Russian propaganda circulating during the Renaissance.
Okay, so Ivan the Formidable, or Ivan the Awe-Inspiring, might be more historically accurate.
Right.
But to understand how he became so formidable, we have to rewind to the very beginning.
Right.
And looking at the sources, his early life reads like an absolute psychological nightmare.
Oh, it's a textbook recipe for severe trauma. Ivan was born in 1530 to the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily III.
Cool.
But when Ivan was just 3 years old, his father died from blood poisoning. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, immediately stepped in as regent to rule on the toddler's behalf.
But she doesn't last long either, right?
No, she doesn't. When Ivan was 8, she suddenly died as well, and it was widely believed by the court, and by Ivan himself actually, that she was assassinated with poison.
So by age 8, this kid is an orphan.
Completely alone.
And he isn't just left in the care of a loving nanny in some quiet countryside estate. He and his younger brother Yuri are suddenly thrust into the absolute mercy of these feuding, ruthless, aristocratic families known as the boyars.
Specifically, the Shusky and Belsky clans.
Right.
These powerful boyars were supposed to be managing the state during Ivan's minority, but instead they were fighting a bloody winner-take-all battle for control of Moscow's treasury and military.
And literally caught in the middle of this crossfire was young Ivan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In letters he supposedly wrote later in life, though some historians debate their total authenticity. Ivan claimed that he and his brother were essentially treated like royal vagrants.
That's wild.
He wrote that they were deprived of proper clothing and basic food, completely neglected by the nobles who were too busy, looting the state.
I was trying to picture this dynamic while going through the sources. It's such a fascinating origin story for a tyrant.
It really is.
It makes me think of like a dangerous high-stakes game of chess where the boyars are moving all these major pieces around, totally ignoring this one little pawn in the corner.
Right. They treated Ivan like he was completely insignificant.
Exactly. But then, almost overnight, that ignored pawn reaches the end of the board, promotes himself to king, and just violently flips the entire table on them.
That is a brilliant way to frame it, because when Ivan makes his move at age 16, it completely blindsides the boyar class.
He doesn't hold back.
Not at all. In 1547, he doesn't just step up and claim the title of Grand Prince of Moscow, which is what his father and grandfather used. He goes much, much bigger.
Right.
He has himself crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia.
I want to make sure I have the etymology right on this. Tsar is the Russian derivation of Caesar, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So by taking that title, he is explicitly linking himself to the Roman Empire.
He is, and the signal he's sending is massive. By taking the title of Tsar, he is actively equating his authority with the Byzantine emperors and the patriarchs.
Wow.
He even goes so far as to adopt a mythological genealogy that claimed direct descent from a supposed brother of the Roman Emperor Augustus.
Talk about a branding exercise.
Right. He was telling the boyars, and the entire world really, that his power wasn't just a political arrangement. It was divine.
He was God's directly appointed leader on earth.
Exactly, meaning his will was absolute and unquestionable.
So picture the setup. You have a traumatized, neglected teenager who has just declared himself an unquestionable divine ruler.
A recipe for disaster, usually.
Exactly. You would totally expect his first official act to be a bloody, vindictive revenge tour against every noble who starved or ignored him.
Right.
But surprisingly, that's not what happens at all. His early reign is actually incredibly constructive.
It's often viewed by historians as the golden era of his rule. Just 2 weeks after this grand coronation, he marries Anastasia Romanovna, who becomes the very first Russian Tsaritsa.
Okay.
And he surrounds himself with a group of relatively progressive advisors known as the Chosen Council. And together they start fundamentally modernizing the very fabric of the state.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of these reforms because reading through them, they are sweeping.
Oh, they changed everything.
He introduces the Sudebnik, which is a completely revised and modernized legal code.
Yes.
He establishes the Streltsy, which is Russia's first standing army equipped with firearms. And he creates the Zemsky Sobor, which operates as the first Russian parliament of feudal estates.
And beyond the domestic overhaul, he launches massive military campaigns to the east and south. He successfully conquers the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates.
This was huge.
It was a geopolitical earthquake at the time. It transformed Muscovy from a relatively isolated regional power into a true multi-ethnic empire.
And it gave Russia complete, uninterrupted control over the entire length of the vital Volga River trade route.
Exactly.
The military logistics behind the siege of Kazan in 1552 are just wild to read about. It wasn't just a medieval army rushing a stone wall with swords.
No, this was a cutting-edge engineering feat.
They brought in foreign specialists. They built these massive mobile wooden fortresses that they actually floated down the river to the battlefield.
Which is incredible to picture.
And they set up a siege crane with 150 heavy cannons. They even went as far as tunneling underneath the city's walls to blow up the underground water supply. It was incredibly sophisticated.
The victory was so monumental that to commemorate it, Ivan ordered the construction of what is now arguably the most famous building in the country.
St. Basil's Cathedral, right in Moscow's Red Square.
The very same.
Okay, I have to pause here, because anytime St. Basil's Cathedral comes up, so does a very famous, very gruesome piece of trivia.
Ah, yes. I know where you're going with this.
The story goes that Ivan was so utterly blown away by the beauty of the cathedral that he ordered his guards to blind the architect, a man named Postnik Yakovlev, so that the poor guy could never build anything as beautiful for another patron ever again.
It is an incredibly sticky myth, and it certainly helps cement the Ivan the Terrible branding.
Right. But is it true?
The historical sources definitively debunk it. Postnik Yakovlev did not lose his eyes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We know this because the historical record shows he went on to design the walls of the Kazan Kremlin in the 1560s. He even designed the specific chapel built over St. Basil's grave, which was added to the cathedral structure after Ivan's death.
So the architect kept his eyes. Good to know.
Very good for him.
And while Ivan is building these architectural marvels, he is also building unprecedented international relationships. This is the era when an English explorer named Richard Chancellor literally stumbles into Russian territory.
While trying to find a northern sea route to India.
Right, and he ends up getting escorted to Moscow. Ivan welcomes him with open arms, which leads directly to the creation of the Muscovy Company and opens up a massively lucrative tax-free trade route with England.
So looking at all these achievements together, Ivan is effectively checking every single box of a great enlightened Renaissance prince.
Yeah.
He is expanding the borders, reforming the legal system, building cultural monuments, and integrating his economy with Europe.
But I want to push back on this narrative just a bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
Looking at the mechanics of these reforms, I found myself questioning his motives. Was he really acting as a benevolent reformer for the good of the Russian people during these early years?
That's the million-dollar question.
Or were things like the new legal code and the standing army just highly calculated moves to strip power away from the local boyar nobles, the exact same people who tormented him as a child?
You are hitting on the absolute core mechanism of his autocracy. Yes, the reforms modernized the state, but they were also explicitly engineered to bypass the traditional nobility.
Okay, so it was deliberate.
Entirely. Think about the Streltsy, the standing army. Before this, a Russian ruler had to rely on the boyars to supply their own private feudal armies for war.
That gave the nobles immense leverage.
Huge leverage. But by creating the Streltsy, Ivan suddenly had thousands of soldiers with firearms who answered directly and only to him.
He cut the nobles completely out of the military equation.
Exactly. He was building a state, yes, but he was building an autocracy simultaneously.
So from the outside, the foundation of this newly minted empire is looking incredibly strong. But underneath that surface, there's this deep, unresolved trauma and simmering paranoia.
And in 1553, a crack appears in that foundation that leads directly into the darkness of the next decade.
1553 is the definitive pivot point of his life.
It really is. Ivan falls severely ill to the point where everyone believes he is on his deathbed.
Right.
Wanting to ensure a stable succession, he demands that the boyars swear an oath of allegiance to his infant son, Dmitri. But many of the most prominent boyars refuse.
Why would they do that?
They assume Ivan is dying anyway, and they have zero desire to be ruled by another infant, which would just trigger another bloody, chaotic regency period like the one they just lived through.
You can just imagine Ivan lying in that bed, physically incapacitated, watching the men who were supposed to be his loyal, divine subjects openly refusing to back his chosen heir.
It was the ultimate betrayal in his eyes.
And then he doesn't die. He survives.
He survives, but the trust is dead. He never, ever forgets that moment of perceived treason.
Which brings us to a causal chain reaction that leads to the 1560s. It's a decade of total disaster for Russia.
Total disaster. You have severe droughts, rampant famine, and military defeats.
But the ultimate psychological blow is the sudden death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560.
And Ivan is absolutely convinced the boyars poisoned her.
Wow.
Her death effectively shatters whatever mental stability he had left. She was supposedly his anchor.
Right.
And to make matters infinitely worse, shortly after she dies, one of his top military commanders and closest advisors, Andrei Kurbsky, defects to the rival Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
And doesn't he actually start leading enemy troops in raids against Russian territory?
He does. It's a massive betrayal.
So in Ivan's mind, the paranoia is fully validated. The traitors are everywhere.
Exactly.
So in 1564, Ivan pulls off what has to be one of the most theatrical, high-stakes political stunts in recorded history.
It is brilliant in a very dark way.
He literally packs up the royal treasury, leaves Moscow entirely, and sends letters back to the city stating he is abdicating the throne because the boyars and the clergy are all treasonous.
It was pure calculated manipulation. He understood that the boyars couldn't rule without him because the general public genuinely believed the Tsar was appointed by God.
So if they tried to take over.
If the boyars tried to seize power, the citizens of Moscow would have torn them apart in the streets. So, just as Ivan planned, a terrified delegation of nobles and clergy travels to him and practically begs him to return to the throne.
And he agrees to come back, but only on one condition. He demands absolute, unchecked power to execute traitors and confiscate their land without any interference from the church or the noble councils.
And desperate to maintain order, they agree.
Which unleashes the Oprichnina. This is arguably the darkest, most terrifying chapter of his reign.
Without a doubt. The Oprichnina was essentially a separate state carved out within the state. Ivan took a massive chunk of the best Russian territory, mostly in the north, and placed it entirely under his personal, exclusive jurisdiction.
And to enforce his will in this new territory, he creates the Oprichniki, which is a personal secret police force.
They owed their status and wealth entirely to Ivan, and they were notoriously brutal.
Yeah, they roamed the countryside on horseback, murdering nobles, forcibly exiling people to monasteries, and seizing massive estates.
Then think about what that actually means on the ground for the economy. These oprichniki would take over a functioning estate and relentlessly extort the peasants who worked the land.
Just squeezing them dry.
Exactly. Sometimes demanding in a single year what they used to pay in 10. The peasants couldn't survive, so they just fled.
So agricultural production completely collapsed, and the price of grain skyrocketed tenfold.
It was an economic catastrophe.
Imagine you're a local merchant or a peasant farmer during this time. One day, a group of armed men in black show up on your land, claim that it now belongs entirely to the Tsar's personal estate, and demand an impossible amount of taxes by nightfall.
You have absolutely zero legal recourse.
It's not just a political purge, it's almost like an autoimmune disease.
Right.
Ivan was so terrified of foreign threats and internal traitors that he turned the state's own white blood cells against its vital organs, attacking Russia itself to try and cure it.
That is a haunting but very accurate analogy.
And the terrifying climax of this is the sack of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan gets a tip, which historians now believe was completely fabricated, that the wealthy trading city of Novgorod is planning to defect to Lithuania.
His response is apocalyptic. Ivan sends the oprichniki to raid the city. They burn it, they pillage it, and the violence is frankly unspeakable.
Yeah, reading the accounts was rough.
They tie men, women, and young children to sleighs, drag them to the freezing waters of the Volkhov River, and drown them.
It's horrible.
They methodically torture the inhabitants. The population of the city at the time was maybe 10,000 to 20,000 people, and modern estimates say anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 of them were brutally murdered in the span of just 5 weeks.
It's horrific to read about, but it brings up a really difficult question that I want your perspective on.
Sure.
How did the Russian people, the everyday citizens who were watching this happen, rationalize this extreme, seemingly random violence from a czar they truly believed was appointed by God?
It requires stepping into a very specific 16th century religious mindset. Ivan genuinely believed and heavily promoted the idea that as God's divine representative on earth, he had a sacred duty to punish the wicked. But not just punish them. He believed he was meant to enact the literal physical torments of hell on earth.
Wow.
When he boiled people alive or froze them in rivers, he was deliberately recreating hellfire and freezing damnation. The tragedy is that many of the people believed that if the Tsar was punishing them, it must fundamentally be God's will.
They viewed it as a divine cleansing wrath, no matter how terrifying it was.
Exactly.
But the terrible irony is that while Ivan is busy terrorizing and cleansing his own people, the actual real-world enemies of Russia are closing in.
Right. The oprichnina system exposed a fatal structural flaw in his paranoia-driven state.
A secret police force is incredibly effective at terrorizing unarmed peasants and local nobles, but they are absolutely useless when faced with a professional invading army.
Yes. In 1571, the Crimean Tatars launch a massive invasion. Because Ivan's actual standing army is bogged down in other conflicts, the Tatars march right up to the gates of Moscow, almost entirely unopposed.
And they burn it to the ground, the
Yeah.
fire of Moscow. The sources indicate that anywhere from 10,000 to 80,000 people died in that inferno.
It was a catastrophic reality check for Ivan. The secret police he built to protect himself completely failed to protect the state.
So what does he do?
The very next year, in 1572, he is forced to formally abolish the oprichnina and disband the oprichniki.
But that doesn't stop the bleeding, because concurrently, he has locked Russia into the Livonian War.
Oh, yes.
He launched this war way back in 1558 to gain critical access to the Baltic Sea, which would have opened up direct maritime trade with Europe. But this war drags on for an agonizing 24 years.
It is a massive drain. It completely bankrupts the country, causes widespread famine, and ends in a humiliating defeat where Russia actually loses territory to Sweden and Poland-Lithuania.
So the empire is crumbling, and Ivan's behavior starts getting exceedingly, bizarrely strange.
Strange barely covers it. In 1575, he actually steps down from the throne again. But this time, he publicly proclaims a Tatar statesman named Simeon Bekbalatovich as the Grand Prince of all Russia.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I'm following the logic here, because this blew my mind.
That's wild.
He's an absolute autocrat, but he just temporarily gives the throne away to this random guy for a year. Why?
Because even absolute monarchs have a PR problem when it comes to religion. I mean, Ivan needed to confiscate vast tracts of wealthy land belonging to the monasteries to fund his wars.
Right.
But the Orthodox Church was incredibly powerful, and taking their land directly would look like a grievous sin for a divine ruler.
Ah, I see.
So Ivan put Simeon on the throne as a puppet. He tells the puppet to pass the deeply unpopular, sinful laws confiscating the church lands. Ivan publicly pretends to oppose the confiscations, playing the humble, pious good guy.
You have got to be kidding me.
Then, after a year, he forces Simeon to step down, takes the throne back, revokes some of the decrees to look magnanimous, but, and here's the kicker, conveniently keeps a massive portion of the confiscated land for the royal treasury.
That is astonishing. It's essentially a massive legal loophole orchestrated by an absolute monarch. He used a stunt double to commit political sin.
It's incredible political theater.
What does this bizarre play acting tell us about his mental state at this point?
It reveals a mind that is undeniably brilliant, deeply cynical, and overwhelmingly paranoid. He is constantly searching for ways to bypass traditional laws and constraints.
And you see this paranoia bleeding into his foreign policy, too.
Oh, absolutely. He was constantly writing letters to Queen Elizabeth I of England, and not just about trade.
Right. He was proposing military alliances, floating the idea of marriage, and
he actually asked her for a formal guarantee of political asylum in England, just in case his own people overthrew him.
which Elizabeth actually agreed to, provided he paid his own living expenses once he arrived.
Naturally, it really highlights how, despite wielding absolute terror over his nation, he felt incredibly vulnerable and insecure.
So the empire is physically exhausted, the economy is in shambles, and the Tsar is looking for an escape hatch. But the true climax of Ivan's descent into darkness doesn't happen on a battlefield or in a treaty. It happens behind closed doors within his own family.
Ivan's personal life was chaotic. Despite strict Orthodox church laws that prohibited even a fourth marriage, Ivan had at least 6, possibly 8 wives over his lifetime.
Which was a massive scandal.
He openly defied the church's authority on this, even plotting at one point to cast aside his 7th wife to marry a relative of Queen Elizabeth.
But the defining, irredeemable tragedy of his life occurs in 1581.
This is the moment that truly cements the moniker the Terrible in the most literal sense.
Ivan brutally scolds his pregnant daughter-in-law, Yelena, claiming she was unsuitably dressed in her own chambers.
Hearing the commotion, his eldest son and highly capable heir, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, rushes in to intervene and protect his wife.
And a furious, screaming argument erupts between father and son.
And in a fit of absolute blind rage, the Tsar strikes his son in the head with his heavy iron-pointed staff.
The blow is fatal. His son dies a few days later, and the trauma of the event causes the daughter-in-law to miscarry the child.
It's just devastating.
There is a deeply haunting painting by Ilya Repin that perfectly captures the immediate aftermath. It shows Ivan clutching the bleeding head of his dying son, his eyes wide with this raw, horrifying realization of the monster he has just become.
It is a moment of profound psychological collapse. He murdered his own flesh and blood, destroying the very dynasty he spent his life trying to secure.
And after this, Ivan is completely consumed by remorse.
He literally compiles exhaustive lists containing the names of the thousands of victims he had executed over the decades.
Yeah, and he sends these lists, along with massive donations, to monasteries across Russia, begging the monks to pray for their souls.
He dies just 3 years later, in 1584, reportedly suffering a stroke while setting up a game of chess.
But what's fascinating to me is what modern science has brought to this historical mystery. In 1963, Soviet scientists actually excavated his tomb and ran forensic tests on his remains.
That's right.
They found that his body was completely asymmetrical, riddled with incredibly painful bone diseases, and crucially, his remains contained massive, lethal concentrations of mercury.
Yes, the researchers concluded the mercury almost certainly came from medicinal ointments he was using daily to treat his severe joint pain.
So it wasn't foul play.
Syphilis and intentional poisoning were ruled out by the team, but the heavy metal toxicity was undeniable.
So looking at the science, we have to ask, could this slow, agonizing, heavy mercury poisoning have directly caused his paranoia, his wild mood swings, and the impulsive murder of his son?
It's a really compelling question.
Are we looking at a psychological breakdown from trauma, or a purely physical poisoning of his brain?
It's highly likely it was a catastrophic collision of both. You have a man with profound, untreated childhood trauma, carrying the unimaginable stress of absolute rule, grieving the sudden loss of his wife, and on top of all that, his neurology is slowly being destroyed by heavy metals.
It doesn't excuse his brutality, but it provides a very chilling biological context for his erratic behavior.
Exactly, and the consequences of his actions long outlived him. Because he murdered his capable heir, the throne passed to his middle son, Fyodor, who was politically weak and ultimately died childless.
This doomed the ancient Rurik dynasty and plunged Russia directly into the time of troubles, an era of famine, civil war, and foreign occupation.
So as we look back at the Tsar dying over a chessboard, what exactly did he leave behind for his country?
He left a profoundly dual legacy. On one hand, he fundamentally created the structure of the Russian state as we recognize it. He expanded the borders east toward Siberia, conquered the Volga, and centralized power into an autocracy that answered only to God.
He built the machinery of an empire.
But on the other hand, the cost of that machinery was devastating. He left his people impoverished, his economy completely depleted by wars and secret police, and his nobility decimated.
And what's even more striking is how his image was weaponized long after his death.
Fast forward to the 20th century, and Joseph Stalin, who had meticulously studied biographies of Ivan, actually ordered the legendary filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein to make a propaganda movie about him.
Stalin wanted Ivan's cruelty portrayed to the public as a necessary and heroic tool to build a strong state.
Stalin literally told the filmmaker that Ivan's only mistake was that he didn't finish off the major noble families completely.
It shows how Ivan's specific blueprint, the idea of rule by terror, became a highly seductive template for future autocrats looking to justify their own violence.
Which brings us right back to where we started. We looked at the ultimate historical contradiction.
What?
The brilliant state builder who was also a paranoid butcher.
Right.
Ivan designed a political system where the ruler was entirely unaccountable to anyone but God, relying purely on fear and terror to maintain control over a vast land.
It really leaves you with a lot to think about.
It does. It leaves you pondering a really chilling question about the nature of power. Did Ivan the Terrible's blueprint ensure that for centuries to come, to rule Russia effectively, a leader had to be terrible? Something for you to mull over as you go about your day. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.